All right, in the last video, you got a good introduction to behaviorist theory, and now we're going to take that to the next step and see how that would look for behaviorists when they talk about personality. Basic premises of behaviorism that apply are that life experiences change people. From the learning perspective, personality consists of tendencies learned throughout life. And it's important to remember much of the research in this tradition has been conducted on animals. They basically see us as more complex animals. So if they study how things work in simple animals, they then feel they can apply that and use that as a starting point to learn about more complex animals. You saw in the last video that the ideas of conditioning were first noted by Pavlov as he studied his dogs, and we saw that the dogs learned to associate the bell with food, and where originally they would salivate when they smelled food, eventually they learned to pair the food and the bell up to the point that eventually just hearing the bell would make them salivate. And as that happened, the salivating moved from an unconditioned response to a conditioned response. Emotional conditioning is looking at how these ideas of classical conditioning can be applied to emotions. And so behaviorists feel that when we have emotional responses, those are still conditioned. It's just our emotions that have been conditioned. And they say this gives rise to our likes, our dislikes, preferences, biases, as we associate what would have been neutral stimuli to events that reflexively cause good or bad feelings. And we saw this with little Albert in the last video. Whenever Watson would make the loud noise, little Albert didn't like the loud noise, and so when he would pair the loud noise with the little furry animals, little Albert eventually became afraid of the little furry animals. You may have experienced this if you've ever gotten sick while eating some certain type of food. Maybe the food didn't make you sick, you were just coming down with the flu. But if you got sick after eating the food, you may have been conditioned to not like that food anymore. Operant conditioning is another important element of behaviorist theory, and this is based on the work by B.F. Skinner, who looked at how we can use rewards and punishments to purposely shape behaviors and emotional responses. And if you had an elementary school teacher where maybe if you were good, you could earn money and go spend in the school store, you were being your teacher's experiment in operant conditioning. They were rewarding you to shape your behaviors. Skinner did a lot of his work with pigeons, and if you want to stop this, you can go watch the other video in Google Classroom that has more of Skinner and his pigeons than was in the last video. They're pretty cute, so I would encourage you to do that unless you are running behind on time. You can always watch it later. But basically, he was rewarding the pigeons with food to teach them certain behaviors. All right, so how does all of this apply to our personality? Behaviorists don't really see there being such a thing as personality, and instead what they see is a collection of behaviors that we have learned through various situations. And so that basically is our personality, but it's not something embedded in us, it's not something in our genetics, it's not based on, how we were born, it's conditioned responses to situations in our environment. And you may even have some different behavioral repertoires in different situations. You may act slightly different in class than you act when you're hanging out with your friends, than you act when you're hanging out with your parents. The ones that are the most core parts of you would be your basic behavioral repertoire, but you may have these others that you slip into very easily based on the rewards and punishments you've gotten for your behavior in those certain situations. What's most important to remember, though, with behaviorists is that they are focusing on behaviors. They're not focusing on cognitions. They're not focusing on feelings. They're focusing on the behavior parts of your personality. They say all emotional responses are linked to conditioned stimuli and then are tied to specific contexts. They also believe that the only way to study anything about humans or other animals is to directly observe behavior. It must be physiological assessment, where we measure physical aspects of emotional responses, or behavioral assessment, where we observe overt behavior. Behaviorists certainly would not give any kind of personality test, and they would absolutely not agree with the projective test we looked at yesterday. Take a minute and think about how well does this explain your personality? What are strengths in explaining personality? What are weaknesses? What does it not explain about who you are as a person? This can give you an idea of where there is some merit. Maybe you're a really conscientious student because of all of those awards that your teacher gave you. Or maybe those didn't work at all and you're still not a very conscientious student. And this behaviorist theory maybe you don't think works so well. For some people it seems to apply more than others. For certain, when we see people who've had some really tough situations, we know it does shape how they react in future situations. So, things like PTSD, certainly having, for soldiers who've been out in fighting war, and when they hear loud noises and they react to that, that's very much a conditioned response. And other types of trauma can condition those responses as well. But for some of our more subtle day-to-day things, maybe it doesn't do such a good job. Now that you're finished, take a few minutes and go look back at your vocabulary if you have time, in class especially, and see what words you should be able to fill in now. Personality we talked about yesterday. We talked about some of the psychoanalytic portions, and now we have basic behavioral repertoire and some of the behaviorist terminology. So take a minute, see what you can fill in for those. And have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.